I had not walked through the front doors of the Omni William Penn Hotel in years, but the scent of polished wood and roses hit me the moment I stepped into the lobby. The place gleamed with chandeliers and marble floors, and every guest I passed seemed to carry a glass of champagne or a phone ready to capture the perfect shot. This was Emily's day. My younger sister, the one who had been groomed to shine, was getting married in front of half the city's business and political elite. I smoothed down the skirt of my simple green dress. Nothing flashy, just something I thought might help me blend into the family I had been away from for so long. My heels clicked against the marble as I followed the usher into the grand ballroom. Music floated from the string quartet waiters in black vests. Balanced trays of hors d'oeuvres and laughter rippled through the clusters of guests dressed in silk and tailored suits. I walked toward the table assignments displayed on a gilded board. My eyes scanned the neat rows of cards, heart steady at first until I reached the M's. Emily Miller, of course, was listed at the head table alongside her groom and our parents. Robert Miller, Margaret Miller, all perfectly in place. Then there it was, Sarah Miller, table 29. My brow furrowed. I searched again. Table 29. My throat tightened. I glanced at the map next to the list, a detailed diagram of the ballroom. Table 29 was not near the stage or the chandelier. It was shoved into the corner by the service doors, right next to the swinging panels, where servers pushed carts of dishes in and out. I froze my fingers, gripping the card harder than I should have. My mother swept by in a crimson gown, her perfume trailing behind her. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away, as if she had not noticed my shock. My father stood near the bar, already nursing a glass of bourbon, eyes deliberately fixed on the floor. Emily appeared in a wave of lace and satin, glowing under the photographer's flashes. She caught my eye and smiled sweetly. "You still have a seat, don't you?" she said lightly, before turning back to greet another guest. The heat in my face spread down my neck. A couple standing nearby whispered to each other. One of them chuckled. "So that's the sister? They've stuck her with the staff." I forced my legs to carry me across the room toward the table. Table 29 had no centerpiece, no polished napkin folds, no wine poured in advance. Instead, it was crowded with bus tubs and pitchers of water, a stack of extra menus tossed carelessly at the edge. Two waiters sat slumped over their phones on their break, glancing up with confusion as I pulled out a chair. I sat back, stiff hands folded tightly in my lap. I could feel the eyes from nearby tables grazing over me, curious, pitying, mocking. The clinking of silverware and the swirl of expensive conversation filled the room, while I tried to swallow the bitter taste rising in my throat. Memories flickered uninvited. The nights I stayed home while Emily was paraded in sequined gowns. The scholarships I fought for, while my parents said money was too tight, only to pay for her dance competitions. The invisible seat I always seemed to occupy at every family table. I pressed my hands against my knees, trying to ground myself, but the humiliation burned hot. A waiter pushed through the swinging doors behind me, nearly knocking into my chair with a tray stacked with plates. I wanted to disappear, but instead, I lifted my chin and forced myself to breathe. After a few minutes, I rose quietly. I told myself I needed to stretch to get some air, but really, I could not sit there any longer. I drifted along the edges of the ballroom, past clusters of laughing cousins and business partners I barely recognized. At the far side of the room, the family had set up an exhibition of old photographs. Enlarged portraits of Emily in ballet costumes, Emily at prom, Emily shaking hands at charity galas. And in the corner, a smaller case of family heirlooms, some old books and silver frames belonging to our grandmother Evelyn. I leaned closer to the glass heart, tightening when I saw one book I remembered from childhood, a heavy leather album with gilded edges. It had always sat on Evelyn's desk, filled with pressed flowers and notes she scribbled in her neat script. Tonight it had been placed among the display items, but someone had left it slightly ajar. I glanced around. Guests were busy posing for photos, no one paying attention. Slowly I lifted the book and let it fall open in my hands. Pages of faded photographs slid past until something caught my eye. A thick envelope yellowed with age tucked deep inside the binding. My breath caught. Across the front, written in Evelyn's familiar hand, shaky but deliberate, were the words, "For my granddaughter." My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. The seal was intact, the paper fragile. I stared at the handwriting, my chest-tight pulse pounding in my ears. For years I had wondered if Evelyn had meant for me to have something more, something beyond the scraps of attention my family allowed. And now, hidden in plain sight at my sister's wedding, here it was. I held the envelope against my palm, unable to open it just yet, feeling as if the room had tilted slightly beneath me. Laughter and music carried on around me, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, quick and insistent. It was as if every sound in the ballroom faded away, leaving me standing alone with the envelope pressed against my chest. My palms felt damp, the seal rough under my fingertips. I thought about Evelyn's voice, low and steady, the way she used to hold my face in her hands and whisper that the world would never hand me anything freely. Family least of all. I slipped the envelope inside my clutch and walked quickly out into the hallway. The music dulled behind the heavy doors, replaced by the hush of carpeted corridors and the distant hum of elevators. I leaned against the wall, drawing in a shaky breath. For a long moment, I only stared at the envelope, terrified of what it might hold and what it might confirm. When I finally tore the seal, the paper crackled in protest. Inside was a folded document yellowed at the edges. My grandmother's handwriting covered the first page firm, but trembling in places. It was a draft of her will dated 2 months before she passed. My name leapt out at me in ink darker than the rest. She had written me as the primary beneficiary of her estate. The air left my lungs. I sat down heavily on a bench in the hall, my knees weak. I read it once, then again, every word piercing deeper. All those years of wondering if she had believed in me more than she could say, and here it was. The proof had been hidden away. Memories opened like old wounds. I was 12 when Emily won her first pageant, our mother clapping so hard her palms turned red, our father snapping photos from every angle. I had stood in the wings with a book under my arm, ignored until someone asked me to move out of the shot. The applause for her echoed in my ears for weeks. At 16, I received an acceptance letter from MIT. I had sprinted across the kitchen with the envelope bursting to tell them. My father had glanced once, then set it aside on the counter. He told me money was tight, that Emily's dance program fees had to come first. Margaret smiled sadly and said maybe scholarships would cover it. I had gone upstairs and cried into my pillow, the letter crushed in my hand. It was always Emily. She was the golden one, the daughter who looked perfect in photos and charmed every guest. I was the afterthought, the serious one, the quiet one. Evelyn was the only person who ever looked at me like I was enough. She used to take me on walks through the park near her house in Shadyside, telling me stories about her own battles with family, how she had fought to keep the business she built when others tried to take it. She would squeeze my hand and say, "You will face the same. Do not let them take what is yours." When she died, I was 20 and raw with grief. At the reading of her will, I sat in the back waiting for my name, but page after page fell in Emily's lap. The house, the investments, even the jewelry. My name was barely a footnote. I told myself Evelyn must have changed her mind, but in my gut, I felt the twist of betrayal. Tonight, with this paper trembling in my hands, I knew I had not been wrong. I closed my eyes, the weight of it pressing hard against me. If this copy was real, then someone had altered the official will. Someone had erased me. My stomach churned with anger and fear. The laughter drifting from the ballroom suddenly sounded cruel, every cheer for Emily, another cut across my skin. A couple walked by glancing at me curiously, so I folded the document and slipped it back into my clutch. My fingers tightened around the bag until my knuckles ached. I could not sit here with this knowledge and do nothing. But I also knew a single piece of paper would not be enough. It could be challenged, dismissed, buried again. I rose from the bench and returned to the ballroom. The music swelled violins bright against the murmur of voices. Emily glided across the room, her hand tucked in her groom's arm, guests circling her like moths around light. My mother spotted me and waved stiffly, her smile practiced, brittle. I stayed near the photo display, far from the tables of champagne and laughter. My pulse was still unsteady. The paper in my clutch seemed to burn through the fabric, heavy with promise and danger. I knew one thing with certainty. Evelyn had not abandoned me. She had chosen me, and someone had stolen that choice. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stir of something I had buried long ago. Resolve. My eyes swept the ballroom landing on my father, lingering near the bar, his shoulders slightly hunched. On Margaret, regal in her crimson gown, directing waiters with sharp flicks of her wrist. And on Emily, radiant under the lights, unaware that the ground beneath her was shifting. I pressed the clutch tighter to my side. The truth was in my hands now, but I needed more. Proof, allies, a plan. And I would have to decide quickly, because this night was only beginning and secrets this large never stayed quiet for long. Glasses clinked around the ballroom as the maitre d' called for a toast. I stayed near the photo display, my clutch pressed hard against my side, still buzzing with the weight of what I had found. The crowd's laughter rose in unison, but another sound broke through, a firm voice behind me, deep and unmistakably commanding. "Miss Miller." I turned, startled, and found myself face to face with Warren Fairchild. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, his navy suit cut to perfection. People shifted as he moved, as if the space around him naturally opened. I knew his name from the business section of the Tribune, the kind of man who sat on boards that decided the fate of companies, the kind of man my parents would bow to. He studied me for a moment, eyes sharp but not unkind. "I used to work with Evelyn," he said softly, almost as if he were reminding himself. "She was one of the only people who could outmaneuver me in a deal." His gaze flicked toward my family, gathered near the head table. "Strange, isn't it, how her granddaughter sits in the shadows tonight?" Heat rose to my cheeks. I swallowed, unsure if he meant it as sympathy or challenge. Before I could reply, he lifted his glass slightly, his voice carrying louder now. "A woman like you does not belong in the corner by the kitchen." The room seemed to freeze. Conversations faltered. Dozens of heads turned toward us. Margaret stiffened across the floor, her hand tightening around her champagne flute. Emily's smile flickered, her grip on her groom's arm tightening. I wanted to vanish, but Warren extended his hand, steady and expectant. "Come with me." My feet moved before my brain caught up. The whispering followed us as he led me through the crowd. Guests leaned toward each other, snapping photos, murmuring speculation. I felt the heat of their curiosity pressing against my skin. When we reached the long table draped in white linen at the center of the room, Warren pulled out the empty chair beside him. "Sit." The words landed like a gavel. I lowered myself into the seat, heart hammering. Across the table sat CEO's attorneys, a senator whose face I recognized from TV. Their eyes flicked between me and Warren, with thinly veiled intrigue. My mother's smile was frozen in place, brittle and sharp. Emily's face had gone pale, her jaw tight as she whispered something to her new husband. Robert avoided looking at me, at all his glass already refilled. Warren leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me. "Evelyn once told me she worried about you. She feared the others would push you aside." He paused, watching me carefully. "She left more than people know. If you have proof, I can help, but you must decide whether you are strong enough to step into the fire." My breath caught. I thought of the envelope in my clutch, Evelyn's handwriting, declaring me her heir. Was he testing me? Or had he somehow known all along? The man on my left, a real estate developer from Cleveland, smiled politely and asked how I knew Warren. Warren answered before I could, introducing me as someone who had saved a multi-million-dollar technology deal in New York when a logistics firm was about to collapse. The developer raised his brows, impressed. Cameras flashed as if on cue. I sat frozen, unsure how Warren knew details of my work, but too aware of the eyes on me to deny it. My fingers clenched in my lap nails, pressing crescents into my skin. Emily's gaze drilled into me from across the room, her expression no longer the soft glow of a bride, but a storm barely contained. The band struck up another song, trying to drown the tension. Waiters glided between tables, refilling glasses, but the energy had shifted. Whispers threaded through the room like smoke. Then I noticed him. At the far end of the table, seated quietly an older man with a worn leather briefcase beside his chair. His hair was white, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were sharp as they locked on mine. He gave a small nod, subtle but deliberate. Recognition stirred. I remembered him from years ago visiting Evelyn's house, poring over documents in her study. "Mr. Hughes," Warren said softly, following my gaze. "He was Evelyn's attorney for decades. He has seen things others wish forgotten." Mr. Hughes did not speak, only held my eyes with a look that told me he knew exactly what sat hidden in my clutch. A chill ran down my spine. I lowered my gaze to my glass, the world around me spinning faster than I could keep up. The music's swelled applause rose for the bridal couple making their rounds, but I barely heard it. Between Warren's pointed words and Hughes's knowing eyes, I realized the night was moving toward something far larger than humiliation at a seating chart. The envelope in my clutch was no longer just a secret. It was the spark in a room filled with tinder waiting for one careless breath to ignite. Emily glided toward me through the crowd, her gown sweeping across the floor, her smile stretched wide for the cameras. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around me, the scent of roses and hairspray clinging to her. Her lips brushed my cheek as she whispered so quietly only I could hear, "You are nothing but the extra one." My body stiffened under her embrace, but I forced myself to return the smile for the guests who applauded the sisters reuniting. She pulled away, glowing for the photographers, leaving me with the sting of her words. My hand slipped instinctively toward my clutch, pressing against the hidden envelope as if it could shield me. Warren raised his voice above the music, telling a story about me stepping in on a New York tech deal that nearly fell apart. He painted me as decisive and sharp, a woman who had turned chaos into stability. The men at the table murmured in surprise, one of them nodding with genuine interest. My cheeks burned not from embarrassment, but from the sudden shift in how the room was starting to see me. Mr. Hughes leaned closer, his voice low. "I saw Evelyn's original will, the one that carried your name. It vanished after she passed. Margaret made sure I was removed before it went to court." My pulse jumped. He sighed and added, "Only proof will crack it open again. You need more than my word." My eyes flicked across the table to my mother. Margaret raised her glass high, her smile dazzling as she thanked the guests for celebrating Emily's big day. Her voice was syrupy sweet, but I caught the tightness in her jaw, the way her knuckles whitened around the stem of her glass. She knew the tide in the room was shifting, and she was desperate to regain control. Phones began to appear above the tables, small red lights blinking as guests streamed live to friends and followers. I heard whispers spreading like brushfire. Why is Warren putting her up there? Didn't Evelyn have another will? What are they hiding? The sound should have terrified me, but instead, a strange calm settled over me. I slipped my hand into the clutch and brushed the folded paper inside. It hummed like a living thing against my fingers. Evelyn's handwriting, her faith in me, suddenly felt like armor. I reached for my glass of water and forced myself to sip, keeping my movement steady. Margaret's eyes darted toward me sharp as a blade, and then away again. Emily sat stiff beside her groom, her smile frozen in place. Her nails dug into his arm, leaving white marks. She was watching me too, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something she could not disguise. Fear. The band tried to swell into another upbeat song, but the air had shifted. Conversations were no longer about the menu or the floral arrangements. They were about me, about Evelyn, about what might have been hidden. My phone buzzed against the table screen, lighting up. A message from Natalie, my partner in the biotech startup back in Chicago. WSJ just leaked it. They're calling us the next big IPO. Valuation $200 million. Call me when you can. I stared at the words, my breath catching. In a single instant, two worlds collided. The humiliation of being shoved to the corner table, the truth tucked in Evelyn's envelope, and now the public acknowledgement that the work I had poured my life into had real power. I looked up slowly, the ballroom tilting in my vision, and realized that everything was about to change. I slid the phone back into my clutch beside the will. Two secrets, one about family and one about my future, sat together like twin blades. My heart pounded not with dread this time, but with a fierce clarity. For years I had been the shadow at every table. Tonight, I felt the ground shifting beneath my family's perfect stage, and I knew the cracks were starting to show. The ballroom noise pressed in on me, a low hum of whispers and camera shutters, but I slipped out quietly through a side door into the hallway. My pulse still raced, my fingers brushing the edge of the envelope in my clutch as if to remind myself it was real. Mr. Hughes was already waiting near the coat check, his briefcase balanced against his leg. He motioned me closer, his voice rough but steady. "If that document is genuine, it can shift everything. But in Pennsylvania, forgery is a felony. 7 years behind bars for anyone proven to have altered a will." His gaze hardened. "Are you ready for that fight?" I swallowed the words clawing at me. 7 years. It was no longer a family dispute, but a matter of law. Hughes leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Margaret had me removed from Evelyn's estate process. I suspected changes were made after your grandmother passed. If you can trace the money, you will see where the fraud begins." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark, a former classmate who now worked in financial analytics. "Call me. Urgent." I stepped back, answering quickly. His voice came sharp through the line. "Sarah, I ran the records you asked about. Your father moved large sums into accounts under Emily's name right after your grandmother died. Those transfers covered a property deal that tanked in Shadyside. He buried his losses by shifting them onto Emily." My knees weakened. I pressed against the wall for balance. "Thank you," I whispered before hanging up. I found my father near the bar, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his tuxedo. The bourbon glass trembled slightly in his hand. I walked straight to him, heart pounding. "Dad, we need to talk." He looked at me, eyes bloodshot, face weary. "Not here, Sarah." I didn't move. "I know about the transfers, about the property deal." His jaw clenched. He stared into his drink as if it might swallow him whole. Finally, he muttered, "I only wanted to protect this family from disgrace. If people knew I failed, it would destroy everything we've built. Margaret promised she would keep my name clean if I signed the papers." The words hit harder than I expected. This was not just weakness, it was complicity. Behind us, I heard a soft intake of breath. Emily stood a few feet away, her face pale, her eyes wet. She had heard everything. She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Don't put this all on me. Mom forced me to take it. She said if I didn't, she would cut me out completely. I didn't want any of it." Her tears streaked down her cheeks, her groom hovering helplessly beside her. The sight should have softened me, but anger flared instead. Emily had smiled while I was shoved to the back table. She had whispered poison in my ear while basking in applause. Now she wanted to be the victim too. Still, I saw the tremor in her hands, the way her chest heaved. She was trapped as much as anyone, pulled into Margaret's schemes like a puppet. I glanced from my father's slumped frame to Emily's desperate eyes and felt the truth settle cold in my chest. They were all entangled. Every layer of this family had bent to Margaret's will, some out of greed, others out of fear. She was the center of the web, pulling every string. I stepped back the hallway, spinning slightly around me. My clutch felt heavier than ever. Proof was one thing, but bringing it into the light would tear apart more than their reputations. It would shred the thin fabric holding this family together. My father finally lifted his gaze to mine, shame clouding his expression. "I only wanted to protect us," he said again, voice hollow. Emily sobbed quietly, her mascara streaking down her face, whispering that she never asked for this. I couldn't answer either of them. The weight of Evelyn's envelope burned against my side. I knew then that Margaret wasn't just complicit. She was orchestrating everything. And if I wanted the truth to survive, I would have to face her head on. I turned away from them both, my chest tight, the sound of the orchestra swelling faintly through the ballroom doors. The night was far from over, and Margaret was waiting inside, smiling for the cameras as if she still held every card. I slipped back into the ballroom, the lights brighter now, the chatter sharper as glasses clinked and waiters rushed by with trays. Margaret stood near the head table laughing with a councilman and his wife, as though nothing in the world could touch her. My stomach twisted. She held her mask steady, but I had already seen the cracks. Warren caught my eye from across the room. He lifted his chin slightly in invitation. I moved toward him, weaving through clusters of guests who parted with curious glances. He led me into a smaller side salon lined with portraits of steel barons and oil magnates, the air quieter but thick with history. He closed the door and turned to me. "Do you have it?" My hands shook as I pulled the copy of Evelyn's will and the bank transfer documents from my clutch. I laid them on the polished oak table between us. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages. After a long silence, he reached into his jacket and drew out a small black flash drive. He set it beside the papers with a measured tap. Inside this, he said, are emails between Margaret and a lawyer she hired after Evelyn passed. They discuss altering language, shifting signatures. It is not speculation. It is a trail. The room tilted. I whispered, "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because Warren said your father once swindled me in a land deal outside Monroeville. I lost millions while he walked away untarnished. I could have destroyed him then, but Evelyn asked me to stay my hand. She believed in second chances." His gaze hardened. "Tonight, I want the truth to stand." I stared at the flash drive, the weight of it pressing against me like a loaded gun. My breath came shallow. Exposing this would shatter the family beyond repair. My father would crumble, Emily's marriage might not survive the scandal, Margaret's carefully built social throne would collapse. But to bury it again would be betraying Evelyn, betraying myself. I pressed my palms to the table, forcing the tremor out of my voice. "If I use this, everything changes." Warren studied me. "That is the point." My phone vibrated, startling me. A message from Natalie lit the screen. "Investors are circling. The Wall Street Journal story just doubled our inbound calls. Everyone wants a piece of the IPO. But if there is scandal tied to your name, it could all unravel." I closed my eyes. My startup had been my salvation, the work that carried me through nights of doubt. Now it was balanced on the same scale as my family's lies. If I kept quiet, the IPO might soar, but the truth about Evelyn's will would die again. If I spoke, the company's future could be stained, but justice might finally breathe. I looked at Warren, his face carved with patience but also expectation. "You have to choose," he said. The sound of distant applause rolled in from the ballroom, as if mocking me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I saw Evelyn's handwriting in my mind, her words telling me not to let them take what was mine. I thought of Emily whispering that I was nothing, of Margaret lifting her glass like a queen, of my father's shameful admission. I picked up the flash drive, its cool weight grounding me. Then I slid the papers back into my clutch. "This wedding," I said quietly, "is no celebration. It is a stage, and if Margaret wants to play queen, let her be judged under the lights." Warren's lips curved, not quite a smile, more a grim acknowledgement. "Then let us see how strong you really are." I left the salon and stepped back into the roar of the ballroom. The band was striking up another tune, guests twirling across the dance floor. Margaret turned, her eyes meeting mine, still bright with that flawless smile. She had no idea I carried the blade that could slice through her kingdom. I tightened my grip on the clutch, the flash drive pressing against Evelyn's will. The decision was made. The stage was set. The night was moving toward its reckoning, and I would no longer stay silent. The master of ceremonies lifted his microphone and called for another toast. Glasses sparkled in the lights. Guests rose from their seats, and the ballroom hushed for a moment of orchestrated joy. My heart pounded so hard I thought the sound would betray me. I rose too, but instead of lifting my glass, I walked straight to the small podium at the edge of the stage. Voices rippled through the crowd. Phones tilted upward, some already streaming live to social media. I felt Margaret's eyes drilling into me, sharp and furious, as she tried to keep her practiced smile. Emily's face was pale, her groom whispering at her side. My father shifted uneasily near the bar, one hand braced against the counter. I cleared my throat and spoke into the microphone, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Tonight is supposed to be about celebration, but celebrations mean nothing if they are built on lies. Gasps stirred through the crowd. I pulled the flash drive from my clutch and handed it to the audiovisual technician stationed near the screens. He hesitated, glancing at Warren, who gave a single nod. Within seconds, the giant monitors flickered the slideshow of wedding photos, replaced by a stream of emails. The text appeared clear as day. Margaret Miller corresponding with an attorney discussing alterations, signature placements, and how to quietly finalize the will without drawing suspicion. The words glowed in stark black and white. A silence thicker than velvet fell over the ballroom. Then came the explosion. Shouts, gasps, phones lifted higher. Guests surged to their feet, pointing at the screen, some recording, others demanding answers. Margaret stood frozen, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. She tried to laugh, a brittle sound, but the room was already against her. I gripped the microphone tighter. I was told I was nothing, pushed to the corner, dismissed at every turn. But Evelyn never abandoned me. She left me her trust, her legacy. You tried to erase me, but the truth will not stay buried. My phone buzzed in my clutch, and without missing a beat I pulled it out. The Wall Street Journal alert glowed on the screen. Sarah Miller's biotech startup set to IPO valuation near $200 million. I held the phone up so the cameras could catch it. This is my work, my life, and it will not be stolen. The crowd erupted, some clapping, some shouting, the noise a roar that rattled the chandeliers. Margaret staggered back, her face contorted, searching for Robert. He looked broken, shoulders collapsing as he stepped forward. His voice cracked. It's true. I let her do it. I couldn't face the shame of my failures. The admission sent another wave of shock across the ballroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. Emily stumbled forward, mascara streaking her cheeks, her voice trembling. She made me take it. She said if I refused, she would cut me off. I never wanted this. The confession broke whatever illusion remained. Guests turned on Margaret with sharp questions and accusations. How could you? How long have you lied? The live feeds carried every word, and within minutes the #weddingtrial began to flash on screens as people across the country watched the spectacle unfold. I stood still, the microphone heavy in my hand, but my voice rose above the chaos. The truth cannot be buried. Justice belongs to those who face it, not those who run from it. The orchestra had fallen silent, their instruments lowered. Security edged closer, unsure whether to intervene. Margaret clutched the edge of the table, her crimson gown pooling around her like a fallen flag. My father sat heavily in a chair, burying his face in his hands. Emily sobbed into her groom's shoulder. I stepped back from the podium, my chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The ballroom had transformed into a courtroom, the guests into jurors, the cameras into recorders of every detail. The mask was gone, and for the first time Margaret had no power to hide behind. I turned toward the doors, the noise of the crowd still echoing in my ears. The night had broken open, but the reckoning was not yet finished. By the time I stepped into the quiet hallway, the ballroom behind me had erupted into a storm of voices and flashing cameras. The air outside felt cooler, sharper, almost cleansing. I could still hear the echo of Margaret's protests muffled through the doors, but there was no undoing what had been unleashed. The truth had slipped free, and it was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. In the days that followed, the wedding headlines dominated every paper in Pennsylvania. Margaret Miller and a prominent estate attorney were both named in official investigations for forgery and fraud. Local news anchors replayed the footage of the emails displayed on the wedding screens, splicing it with my father's confession and Emily's tearful words. Commentators debated how long the deception had been in play. The story was no longer a family scandal. It was a public reckoning. One morning I opened the Tribune and saw the front page. From the staff table to the VVIP spotlight, the truth exposed at Miller wedding. A photograph captured me standing at the podium, clutch in hand, the screen behind me glowing with evidence. I stared at the image for a long time, not because I liked the attention, but because, for once, I was not invisible. My startup became the second wave of coverage. Reporters who had once ignored me now called daily, eager to profile the biotech company I had built from a rented workspace in Chicago. Warren Fairchild held a press conference announcing a strategic partnership with us, naming me a new leader for the future of healthcare technology. His words landed in every business column and pushed investors further toward us. For the first time, my work was recognized not as an afterthought, but as something vital. In the middle of it all, Emily called. She asked me to meet her in a coffee shop near her apartment. I almost refused, but curiosity drew me there. She arrived without makeup, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired. She looked smaller without the glow of a ballroom around her. She held her cup with both hands and whispered that she only wanted freedom from Margaret, that she had been trapped for years under her control. She asked if I could forgive her. I listened, but I did not give her an answer. My silence hung between us heavier than any words could. Some wounds do not heal with apologies, and some truths must be answered in court, not in coffee shops. Weeks passed, and the investigation gathered momentum. Margaret fought back with her lawyers, but the evidence was clear. She no longer glided through society events or posed for glossy magazines. She was seen instead, walking into courtrooms, her shoulders stiff, her smile finally gone. My father kept to himself, no longer the proud patriarch, and I wondered if he replayed his choices at night. 1 month after the wedding, I flew to New York for the International Health Innovation Conference. The stage was set in a hotel ballroom, just as grand as the one where the truth had erupted, but this time, the spotlight was mine to own. My company's name flashed across giant screens, our research into treatments for Parkinson's disease highlighted in presentations from physicians and scientists. When I walked to my table near the front, labeled VVIP, I felt a calm pride settle over me. I had not been invited there. I had earned it. After the conference, Warren handed me a sealed envelope. Evelyn had trusted him with the original letter she wrote in her final months. Alone in my hotel room, I opened it carefully. Her handwriting was familiar, a little shaky, but strong. She wrote that she believed I would face betrayal, that lies might cover the truth for a time, but that justice never dies. She asked me to carry her legacy with integrity, not vengeance. I sat for a long time after reading, tears blurring the words, realizing she had always seen me, even when no one else did. I closed the letter and placed it beside my notes for the keynote speech I would deliver the next day. For the first time in years, the ache of being forgotten was replaced by the weight of responsibility, a responsibility I was ready to carry. The memory of that night in Pittsburgh still lingered, the laughter, the whispers, the crash of glass on marble. But now it was framed not as my humiliation, but as the turning point where truth finally forced its way into the light. If you have ever been pushed aside, if you have ever been told you were nothing, remember this. Lies crumble and masks fall, but truth and resilience will always find their way to speak.